Hello, good evening, and welcome to the Comics Experience Graphic Novel of the Month Club Comics Masterpiece Edition. We've got a really good book this month. One of the books that I would say is very much responsible for me to owning a comic shop at all, for my development as a reader and what my interests are and what ultimately this store became. So I don't think we'd have a Graphic Novel of the Month Club if it wasn't for this book, which is Saga of the Swamp Thing, Volume 1, written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Stephen Bissette, who is right here. Hello, Steve. How are you, my friend?
Hello, Brian. It's great to see you and hear you. So thanks for having me.
But very, very, very happy to do so. This is my version of Saga of the Swamp Thing, my first edition copy, which is what's on my bookshelf at home, and it is beat to crap. You really can't see how bad
it's well loved. A well loved,
It's a well loved book, yeah. So, but it's a different version than this. It's got different contents, but in fact, I still have my copy of Swamp Thing 20 as an individual comic book on the shelf next to that because 20 isn't in this book. This starts with 21. So that's my little thing there. That's silly. So you have had your brain lit on fire by Crumb, particularly.
Well, no, actually, it was Greg Irons, particularly.
Oh, was it Greg? Oh, okay.
Yeah, Crumb was the first I read, but by Zap number 2 and 3, S. Clay Wilson quickly became an addictive favorite, and Victor Moscoso, which probably most people wouldn't associate with. You know, I've never done anything like Moscoso's, but I think my favorite two cartoonists were Moscoso and definitely S. Clay Wilson. S. Clay Wilson would just like appall and crack me up every time. But then I stumbled onto, I'm trying to remember what the first Greg Irons I read, probably Slow Death, an issue of Slow Death. And then I found out about Skull, and Greg Irons became the underground cartoonist for me. And there were others I really loved. I loved Charles Dallas's work. He had that kind of woodcut drawing style, and he had his own comic called Psychotic Adventures. But it was really Greg Irons, and particularly Tom Veitch and Greg Irons. The GI TV team, their comics were the best. They were just, to me, the best. And that's because of the bent of my nature that I loved horror comics already.
Yeah. So you started drawing your own stuff at that point?
Yeah, it was weird stuff too, you know. Like I remember, I don't have that sketchbook anymore. I gifted it to a friend back in college. I wish I had a scan of that sketchbook. I had like, you know, weird spacey 1- and 2-page comics that I would draw. I only drew with ballpoint pen, and eventually those little fine point pilot markers. Like that's all I drew with. So, and then Greg Irons, I was captivated by Greg's work, but I couldn't figure out what drawing tool he worked with. And I experimented with brushes, but the only brushes I could get my hands on were really shitty. and I gave up on that. I just could not emulate Greg's line. But I was drawing my own comics, and then it was really Skull number 6, which came out in 1972. I was a junior in high school still. Skull number 6 came out, and have you read that comic, Brian?
Sure.
Skull number 6.
I mean, it's been 20 years probably.
Okay, so. Well, the Skull number 6 is the only issue of Skull that's a single story. And part 1, it was a gothic tale. It was all written by Tom Veitch. And part 1 was illustrated by Greg Irons, and part 2 was illustrated by Richard Corbin. And I loved Corbin's work as well. And Greg Irons' chapter, the part 1, builds to this page turn that when I turned the page, so freaked me out that I dropped the comic on the floor. Like it was like I had to get it out of my hands because it was so terrible. What was happening in the story and the image that I was looking at was so awful that I dropped it on the ground. And my immediate thought was, I want to do this to people. Like, okay, how can I get this good, you know? And it was really Skull number 6 that the fire had been lit, but Skull number 6 was the one that was like, man, I have to do horror comics, you know? I have to get this good if I possibly can.
you came on Swamp Thing, I want to say 16, is that right?
Yeah. Prior to that, Tom Yates, you know, classmate from the Kubert School. We both graduated spring of '78. Tom Yates was the first Kubert School student to break through doing freelance for DC. And Tom was on Saga of the Swamp Thing right from the beginning. And when Tom started the book, it was already behind deadline. Tom started against the 8 ball, and he was also penciling and inking the comic, right, himself. So starting with number 2 of Saga of the Swamp Thing, classmates, particularly John Toddleben and Rick Veitch, who were still living in the Dover, New Jersey area. Tom had moved to a really nice place right on Lake Hopatcong in New Jersey. They were pitching in and helping Tom, starting with Saga of the Swamp Thing number 2. And I have to stress to your graphic novel book club members that this was not unusual. Like, you know, we had been housemates since we graduated from the school. The way we all lived and worked together is we would jam when there wasn't paying work and try to, you know, sell stories that we had cooked up. If one of us had a paying gig, all of us would lend a hand. Our role model was the Flegels, right? So Al Williamson, Roy Krenkel, Frank Frazetta, you know, that team of guys from the 50s were very much sort of role models for us, particularly heroes of Tom Yates. So we were really used to pitching in and giving each other a hand. It was just part of how, you know, that's how we all got by, and that was part of the fun of being cartoonists together. So Tom had help from John and Rick off and on, starting with issue 2. The first issue of Swamp Thing, Brian, that you'll find my name snuck into is I laid out Saga of the Swamp Thing number 8, and on the splash page there's a dinosaur on the splash page, and Tom slipped layouts SRB upside down underneath the dinosaur's tail. Oh, it's there, lettered in. Cool. And I think the other book that Tom credited us, John and I, on was, I think, number 13. And Tom let us know, you know, right around issue 13, he said, I'm on my way out of here. Like, I've given Len my notice. You guys should try out for this. And we started on the book with issue 16. Yeah. Marty Pasco, the late, great Marty Pasco, he just passed away this past year, unfortunately, was the writer on the book at that time.
So Alan comes on with 20.
Yeah.
And I have to imagine that his scripts are very, 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 very different than Marty's.
Oh my God. They were night and day. You know, that first Swamp Thing that Rick, John, myself worked on from an Alan script, issue 21, the anatomy lesson, is a perfectly structured, self-contained story. Yeah. It frames itself. It begins where it ends where it begins. And between that, these characters go through these remarkable arcs, and Alan introduces a multitude of new ideas, and it all works.
Yeah.
And that script was a revelation. I mean, part of why I called Rick Veitch immediately when I got the script was, A, I needed help, okay, and B, he had to read it, because as soon as I read it, I mean, I had short hair back then. The hair went up on the back of my neck as I read that script, because it was like, oh my God, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And the only time we got to enjoy those comics are when we read those scripts, because after that, it was hard work, right? So we had seen individual works of comics that had pushed it, but Alan really had mastered it in a way where every single issue that we did together, he was changing it up. He had another approach. He had a fresh orientation. It was incredible. It was incredible.
Yeah. And he also just had such a gift for words and language and creating texture. You know, 30 years later, I can still vividly remember the line about the sunset, you know, and the bayou that looks like the sky had slit its wrists. You know, like
right.
Wow, like what an image! Like if I had read that in a novel, that would have been just a perfect little chestnut. And to encounter in a comic where you never got dialogue like that, or descriptive, you know.
Sure, but even more importantly, and the things that people don't talk about, and particularly, I mean, I read almost all the academic texts because I've been working as an educator for 15 years. I've been very steeped in the academia of comics as well. And there's a lot of academia out there about Alan Moore, trust me.
Sure, of course,
And what they don't get, because they're writers, they're not artists, what they don't get by and large is the other thing that Alan did that very few other writers had ever done in comics is he engaged all the reader's senses, okay? In Swamp Thing 29, the Love and Death issue, the one that we lost the comics code on, okay? Alan sets up at the beginning, on the first page, a smell, that there's a smell. There's some odor that Abby can't identify, that the house reeks of, and that she can't get out of her clothes or her skin or her hair. She just smells it. And it's not until the end of the issue that Alan comes back to it, and it's the smell of an ant roasting under a magnifying glass, right? It's the smell of an insect's body crisping. And he's engaged your sense of smell. And the other thing Alan does in that same script, in that same issue, is he also sets up this visual mystery that is not overt at any time in the text, okay? And it's that the mystery of what is reanimating the dead. And at the end of the story, Swamp Thing is walking along and he sees a bird lying on the swamp, you know, on the grass, and it seems to be moving, and he reaches down to pick it up because he thinks it's injured. And as he picks it up, he realizes it's not injured, it's dead. And why is it moving? There's maggots inside of it. And this is how Alan cues the reader that it's insects, which we have now visually associated with arcane, that are the reanimating agent. This is smart comic book writing. This is engaging the reader's tactile senses, the sense of smell. Alan always, you know, without being particularly showy about it, I didn't think anyway, would engage the reader on levels that we weren't used to being engaged in most comic stories.